Why didn't the Targaryens do anything about the others? If Aegon the Conqueror conquered because he had a dream about them and it was passed down generation to generation, why not do something? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into George R. R. Martin's world of A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as all the offshoots, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg and more. Oh, and other great fantasy worlds too, like The Lord of the Rings and The Witcher. We now know, courtesy of House of the Dragon and George R. R. Martin himself, that Aegon I conquered Westeros because of a dream. A dragon dream about an existential threat from the north that needed a united Westeros ruled by a Targaryen to defend it. George R. R. Martin had hinted at it a few years earlier, and fans had speculated, but this is now as close to canon as we'll get until we actually see it written down on a page in A Song of Ice and Fire. And I'll admit that I resisted buying into this idea for a long time before we got this confirmation, because it didn't quite hang together for me as an idea. How could the Targaryens have been driven by this prophecy if they so very rarely even bothered to go to the wall to inspect the defences, and in the 300 years of their rule, they let the Night's Watch descend into a shadow of its former self? Well, after going back to the books and thinking about it all more than is probably healthy for me, I think I've come to an understanding of how that might have come to be. And that's what I'll share with you in this video. I'll start, though, by giving a quick shout-out to Joe Magician, who did a video on this very subject a year ago, which is very good. I'll leave a link to it in the description. These thoughts are built in part on what he says there. So the timeline goes something like this. Aegon I gets a dream, a dragon dream, sometime before he decided to invade Westeros. This isn't rare for Targaryens, and they will be inclined to believe what the dream says. Just 3 generations earlier, the entire family had abandoned Valyria because of a dream, but they survived while their entire culture and people were destroyed in the Doom. This is how Viserys, over a century later, describes the dream to his heir Rhaenyra. Aegon foresaw the end of the world of men. It is to begin with a terrible winter, gusting out of the distant north. Aegon saw absolute darkness riding on those winds, and whatever dwells within will destroy the world of the living. When this great winter comes, Rhaenyra, all of Westeros must stand against it, and if the world of men is to survive, then a Targaryen must be seated on the Iron Throne, a king or queen strong enough to unite the realm against the cold and the dark. Aegon called his dream A Song of Ice and Fire. This secret, it's been passed from king to heir since Aegon's time, and now you must promise to keep it, and to carry it. He also shows her the dagger, which we much later call the cat's paw dagger. We're told that Aegon had the dream inscribed on it, visible when you put it in the flames. That reads, "From my blood come the prince that was promised, and his will be the song of ice and fire." Which seems more of an addendum to the initial dream than the actual dream itself, though the only part that seems to have been written down. We'll come back to the prince that was promised element later. Now, the important starting point here is that dreams and prophecies and visions are not necessarily to be trusted in George R. R. Martin's world. Yes, they can be true, but it is how they are interpreted that often makes things harder. Take Melisandre in the main A Song of Ice and Fire story, for example. No one doubts that she sees visions in the flames, and there is truth there, but it's how she interprets them that drives the action. Here, crucially, we don't see the actual dream, nor do we hear Aegon's exact words in describing it. What we have are Viserys' words more than a century and 4 generations later. And that does not give any details about the threat itself, other than it comes from the north in winter, in darkness, and that whatever dwells within it will bring an end to the living. Whatever dwells within it is not exactly clear, so the focus of what Viserys says is understandably on the Targaryen response to that. A Targaryen must be seated on the Iron Throne, and the realm must be united. Adding in what is written on the dagger, the Targaryen who is around when all this comes to fruition is to be known as the prince that was promised. We have no way of knowing how much detail was lost between Aegon and Viserys, but it's fair to say that Aegon does the logical, if rather bloodthirsty thing in the light of these priorities. He invades the 7 kingdoms and establishes his throne. Although some parts of the invasion were relatively straightforward, the Vale of Arryn just took a single dragon landing at the Eyrie, for example, others aren't, like Dorne. The North, led by Torrhen Stark, came down south with an army to confront the conquerors, but after a quick parley and a look up close at the dragons, they decide to bend the knee and head back north in safety. We read that King Torrhen sent his brother Brandon Snow across the Trident, but he crossed with 3 maesters by his side, not to kill, but to treat. All through the night, messengers went back and forth. The next morning, Torrhen Stark himself crossed the Trident. There, upon the south bank of the Trident, he knelt, laid the ancient crown of the Kings of Winter at Aegon's feet, and swore to be his man. There have been various theories in the fandom around exactly what was discussed there. Perhaps Aegon shared his dream of a threat from the far north with Torrhen, and Torrhen told him of the Wall and the others, and how his house words were "winter is coming," and they reached a pact of ice and fire of some kind based on dragon dreams and the North remembering. Perhaps, but we don't have any evidence that it did happen, and it's not actually needed for what followed to make sense. All that's actually needed is for Torrhen to bend the knee in exchange for Aegon not burning his entire army and homeland to a crisp, and for Aegon to be convinced that the Wall was well guarded, as it was at the time, with 10,000 men, and that the Starks would keep an eye on things as the new Wardens of the North. If something terrible did come from the North, the Starks would tell him. That left Aegon to focus on unifying the 7 kingdoms, which he proceeded to try to do for the rest of his reign, first with repeated attempts to subjugate Dorne, then by codifying laws and making progresses around the land to reinforce the concept of a unified continent. His sister wife Rhaenys supported this by proactively matchmaking across the 7 kingdoms, so people were united by blood as well as just by having the same king. Interestingly, despite Aegon doing 6-month-long progresses across the 7 kingdoms every year for most of his reign, it took him 30 years to actually visit Winterfell. You could see this as a curious oversight if he really does believe that there's an imminent threat from the north, or perhaps it's actually a sign that Aegon trusted Torrhen. Either way, it's noticeable that when Aegon does finally go to Winterfell, it's for his last progress. A chance perhaps to see Torrhen's heir, to ensure himself that his trust is good for another generation. Because Aegon eventually has to have come to understand that the dream wasn't going to be fulfilled in his own lifetime. That's why he made the engraving on the dagger and instituted the passing down of the dream to his successors. One of them would need to face the threat. And maybe that's also why Visenya seems to have become increasingly desperate for the, in her eyes, very weak and indecisive Aenys not to inherit, but for her own, very strong and very decisive son Maegor to do so instead. Leaving aside the other aspects of their characters, which would you rather lead the living in a desperate fight for survival? Of course, both Aenys and then Maegor had their chance to rule, and neither paid much attention to what was going on in the north. They certainly didn't visit. They were simply trying to cling on to power, with rebellions and the faith uprising everywhere. The next king, though, Jaehaerys, did have time. He reigned for 55 years, and although it wasn't always completely peaceful, it was compared to his predecessors. And he, together with Alysanne, his wife and effective co-ruler, did the boring but necessary work of tying the 7 kingdoms together, building the road network, codifying the laws, arranging marriages between different families. And eventually, quite a few years into his reign, it has to be said, he gets around to visiting Winterfell. Alysanne beats him to it and visits the Wall and the Night's Watch herself. You can read about all that happened during that visit in Fire and Blood, but the result was a massive increase in support to the Night's Watch. A new castle, a huge swathe of land, the new gift to support them, and so on. Jaehaerys, and very probably Alysanne, knew about Aegon's prophecy, so here, indisputably, the Targaryens were doing something to help protect the 7 kingdoms about a possible threat from the north. But after that, things slow back down again. We have no record of Viserys going to Winterfell or the Wall during his reign, though there is the curious visit of Jaehaerys Targaryen during the opening acts of the Dance of the Dragons. At the time of writing this, we don't know what they will show as happening on House of the Dragon Season 2, but in Fire and Blood, there are lots of rumours, but only 2 clear outcomes. The Starks agree to join the war on Rhaenyra's side, and a marriage pact is agreed between the 2 houses known as the Pact of Ice and Fire, which ultimately came to nothing. After the Dance of the Dragons, The Targaryens seemed to largely ignore the wall once more, focusing instead on bringing dawn into the Seven Kingdoms, preventing the Seven Kingdoms from falling apart in a series of rebellions, and trying desperately to bring back the dragons, for the dragons had all died during the dance and shortly after. And to be fair, if we are here critiquing the Targaryens on their ability to adhere to dreams and prophecy for the second half of their time ruling Westeros, they seem to be under a new prophetic injunction. They are not to just hold the kingdom together and stay on the Iron Throne in the face of a threat from the north, but above all, they have to get the dragons back. We see this in so many different ways. Daeron I claiming that he was the dragon, Aegon IV trying to build mechanical dragons, Baelor praying over dragon eggs, Aegon III and Aegon V trying to hatch dragon eggs, Aerion and Aerys II trying to do weird things with wildfire, believing that they would turn into dragons. It's harder finding a Targaryen in this era who wasn't obsessed with getting dragons back than one who was. And it is during this period, when the Targaryens are obsessed with hatching dragon eggs, that the Night's Watch starts to go seriously downhill. The biggest blows came just after the Dance of the Dragons. First, Queensgate, the new castle bankrolled by good Queen Alysanne, was overrun and destroyed in an attack by the wildlings in the year 133. Then, the next year, a third of the Night's Watch died in a particularly harsh winter, and hundreds more dealing with the various wildling incursions. I've speculated in live streams, and if you're wondering where my live streams are these days, they are on every Thursday as usual, but on my second channel, IDG Live, along with plenty of other new content. There's a link in the description. But I've speculated that perhaps at some point, Aegon's original prophecy ceased to be handed down from monarch to monarch. There were certainly plenty of moments when it could have been lost. Did Rhaenyra have time to tell her son, the future Aegon III, then aged just 10 years old, the whole prophecy before she died? Did Aegon IV pass it on to Daeron II, despite his apparent doubts over his legitimacy? Did Baelor, who spent so long burning books of prophecy, really pass it on to anyone? You get the idea. In any event, it seems likely that Aerys I rediscovered it, or some of it. But by then, though, the concept of urgency seems to have been somewhat lost. Other than the notable exception of sending Bloodraven, many of his personal guard and Maester Aemon to the wall in 233, successive Targaryen monarchs largely ignored the wall in the Night's Watch. They mostly didn't visit, they didn't send money or aid or rebuild any castles, and the quality of person who was sent up there descended from, say, Kingsguards and noble lords who did wrong, down to whoever happened to be in the Red Keep's dungeons at the time, usually the worst sort of scum and villainy in Westeros. In short, supporting the Night's Watch was not even part of a slow lowering of priority. It was generation after generation of rulers not even thinking it was relevant. That said, by the time we reach Rhaegar and the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, there does seem to have been some re-establishing of an understanding of the importance of the original prophecy. Aegon I called that prophecy the Song of Ice and Fire, and in A Clash of Kings, Dany has a vision of Rhaegar saying that the Song of Ice and Fire belongs to his son. Rhaegar himself was also the result of a marriage between Aerys II and Rhaella that only happened because of a prophecy that the prince that was promised would come from that line. Both are clear callbacks to that original dream. Presumably, the spark here was partly Aemon's letters from the Night's Watch to Rhaegar, and partly the Woods Witch, presumably sent by Bloodraven from beyond the wall. In other words, the only two Targaryens we know of who have been sent to join the Night's Watch, the Watchers on the Wall against the threat from the north, are the people responsible for pushing the Targaryens back into taking Aegon's original prophecy seriously. In even simpler terms, when in doubt, blame Bloodraven and Maester Aemon this time. So why did the Targaryens not do anything about the others or help the Night's Watch? Well, Aegon himself felt that he could trust the Night's Watch at the time to keep doing their job, and he was probably right, so he focused on the things he thought were in his control, namely uniting the Seven Kingdoms. His sons had enough on their plates simply trying to stay in power. His grandchildren, Alysanne and Jaehaerys, actually did take helping the Night's Watch seriously, building them a new castle and granting them lots of new resources. Then after that, well, the Dance of the Dragons and its aftermath meant that there was a new prophetic priority for the Targaryens, getting the dragons back. And almost all of them, with varying degrees of sanity, focused on that. Again, I think that's understandable. Having dragons is a game changer. Finally, in the last few years of their rule, the Targaryens did start taking the whole prophecy seriously once more, focusing in on identifying who this mysterious prince that was promised might be, and in some instances, proactively trying to equip them to be this child of prophecy. The tragedy is, of course, that the two leading candidates to actually be the prince that was promised, Jon and Dany, were born not knowing Aegon's dream, and arrive in the story at a time when the land is far from united and neither sit on the Iron Throne. Nevertheless, a terrible winter is gusting out of the distant north. The Night's Watch are far from prepared, and the dragons are far, far away. If either or both are to unite the realm to stand against the others, there is a lot of work to be done first. If you'd like to see more videos diving deep into George R.R. Martin's world of Ice and Fire, there's a link to a playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, the best way to do that is through Patreon. That's the link on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.